November 1943. Camp McCain, Mississippi. The base commander stared at the requisition form in his hands, reading it for the third time. 20 Italian prisoners wanted to borrow musical instruments from the camp supply. Violins, a trumpet, something they called a clarinet in B-flat. The request cited Geneva Convention Article 17, which guaranteed prisoners access to recreational activities. He signed it, assuming they'd play some folk songs in their barracks. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. Within 2 weeks, the sounds drifting from the prisoner compound weren't folk songs. They were arias. Full-throated, technically precise operatic arias that carried across the pine trees and red clay roads of rural Mississippi. Guards stopped their patrols to listen. The camp chaplain, walking past one evening, heard someone singing Vesti la Juba from Pagliacci, with such raw emotion that he stood frozen until the final note dissolved into the humid air. When he asked around, he learned the singer had been a professional tenor in Naples before the war. And he wasn't the only one. Camp McCain held approximately 3,000 Italian prisoners by late 1943, part of the roughly 51,000 Italian POWs spread across American camps after Italy's surrender in September. They'd been captured in North Africa, in Sicily, in the initial Allied pushes up the Italian peninsula. Most were young, conscripted soldiers who'd never wanted to fight in the first place. They'd been shipped across the Atlantic in the holds of Liberty ships, seasick and terrified, wondering if they'd ever see home again. Now they found themselves in Mississippi, a place so foreign it might as well have been another planet. The Americans didn't know what to make of them. These weren't the fanatical enemies they'd been taught to expect. The Italians were chatty, expressive, and seemingly more interested in cooking than fighting. They complained constantly about American food. The coffee was too weak. The pasta was mushy. Where was the garlic? Where was the olive oil? The guards, mostly farm boys from the South, found it oddly endearing. These prisoners didn't seem dangerous. They seemed homesick. But the music changed everything. Word spread through the camp that some of the prisoners had serious talent. A corporal named Antonio Bellini had sung at La Scala before the war. A private, Giuseppe Romano, had been studying conducting at the Rome Conservatory. There was a set designer, a violinist who'd played in the Naples Symphony, even a costumer who'd worked on productions in Florence. The war had swept them all up and deposited them in Mississippi, but it hadn't erased what they knew. By December, they'd formed a real orchestra. 18 musicians, rehearsing every evening in a converted storage building. The camp commander, Colonel James Watkins, heard about it from his staff. Against his better judgment, he went to listen one night. He expected amateur hour. What he heard stopped him in his tracks. They were playing Verdi, the Nabucco overture, clean and tight, with a passion that made his chest ache. He stood outside in the December chill until they finished, then walked back to his office and made a decision that would change everything. He authorized them to stage a full opera. Not just a concert, but a complete theatrical production with sets, costumes, and staging. His staff thought he'd lost his mind. These were enemy prisoners. There was a war on. But Watkins saw something else. He saw men who needed purpose, who needed to remember they were human beings, and not just numbers in a camp. And maybe, secretly, he wanted to see if they could actually pull it off. The prisoners chose Rigoletto. It was technically demanding but emotionally direct, and they had a baritone who could handle the title role. For 2 months, the camp transformed. Men who'd been languishing in boredom suddenly had purpose. They built sets from scrap lumber. They sewed costumes from whatever fabric they could scrounge. A former architect drew up designs for a revolving stage mechanism. The music director drilled the orchestra until they could play Verdi's intricate score without mistakes. But there was a problem. They needed women. Opera requires female voices, and Camp McCain was exclusively male. The solution came from an unexpected source. Colonel Watkins contacted nearby Grenada College, a women's school about 30 miles away. He explained the situation to the college president, who was intrigued enough to mention it to her music department. 3 young women volunteered. They were driven to the camp under guard, rehearsed with Italian prisoners of war, and drove back. It was surreal for everyone involved. Sarah Mitchell was one of those women. Years later, she'd recall her first rehearsal. "I was terrified. We'd been told Italians were the enemy, and here I was singing a duet with a man who'd fought against our soldiers. But Giuseppe, the tenor, was so professional, so focused on the music. Within 10 minutes I forgot he was a prisoner. He was just another musician trying to get the phrasing right." The performance was scheduled for March 15, 1944. Initially, it was meant only for the prisoners and camp staff. But word leaked into the surrounding communities. People were curious. Some were scandalized. The editor of the local newspaper wrote a scathing editorial, asking why enemy soldiers were being given entertainment while American boys died overseas. But others felt differently. Music was music. Art was art. And Mississippi in 1944 didn't exactly overflow with cultural opportunities. Colonel Watkins made another controversial decision. He'd allow local civilians to attend. Not many. Maybe 50 seats, but enough to fill out the makeshift theater they'd constructed in the camp's largest building. The tickets were free, but people had to apply and be vetted. The response overwhelmed him. Within days, he had applications from over 300 people. Farmers, teachers, businessmen, housewives. Everyone wanted to see enemy prisoners perform Italian opera in rural Mississippi. March 15th arrived with unseasonably warm weather. The camp buzzed with nervous energy. The performers had been preparing for months, but stage fright is universal. Antonio Bellini, the former La Scala tenor who'd sing the Duke, paced backstage chain-smoking. Giuseppe Romano conducted final rehearsals, adjusting tempos and reminding the orchestra about a tricky transition in Act 3. The set builders made last-minute repairs. The costumers fussed over details. The civilian audience arrived at 7 p.m., escorted through security checkpoints and into the theater. They found themselves in a space that had been transformed. The stage looked professional. The lighting, rigged from salvaged materials, actually worked. The orchestra, dressed in makeshift formal wear, tuned their instruments. It felt impossible that this existed inside a prison camp. When the curtain rose, something magical happened. For the next 2.5 hours, the war disappeared. The barbed wire fences dissolved. National boundaries ceased to matter. There was only Verdi's music, sung by men who'd once been enemies, accompanied by an orchestra of prisoners, watched by Americans who'd come expecting curiosity and found themselves experiencing art. Antonio Bellini's voice soared through La Donna Mobile with such clarity and power that women in the audience dabbed their eyes. The Duke's callous charm, his careless seduction, his ultimate tragedy, all came through in Bellini's performance. He wasn't just singing notes. He was embodying a character, making people feel something profound. When he finished his final aria, the audience sat in stunned silence for 3 seconds before erupting into applause that seemed to shake the building. But the real heartbreaker was Giuseppe Romano's Rigoletto. This jester, this broken father, this man destroyed by his own desire for revenge. Romano poured everything into it. Every note carried the weight of a man far from home, uncertain if he'd ever return, desperate to create something beautiful in a world that felt irredeemably broken. When he sang Cortigiani, Vil razza dannata, his rage and desperation were so raw that several people in the audience wept openly. The final scene, where Rigoletto discovers his daughter dying in the sack he thought contained his enemy, destroyed everyone. Romano's grief felt absolutely real. Because in a way, it was. These men had lost everything. Their country had collapsed. Their families were an ocean away. They didn't know who was alive or dead. The opera gave them permission to express the grief they'd been carrying for years. When the curtain fell, the applause lasted 10 minutes. Americans and Italians stood together. clapping until their hands hurt. Colonel Watkins, watching from the back, felt something shift in his chest. These weren't enemies. They were men. Artists, human beings who'd been caught up in forces beyond their control and were trying to hold on to their humanity through music. The next morning, the review in the local newspaper was rapturous. Last night, Camp McCain witnessed something extraordinary. The critic wrote, "These Italian prisoners have brought world-class opera to Mississippi. The performance would have been impressive anywhere. That it happened in a POW camp makes it miraculous." The same editor who'd written the scathing editorial ran a full-page feature with photographs. Suddenly, everyone wanted tickets. The camp received requests from across the South: churches, civic organizations, music clubs. Could they see the opera? Could the prisoners perform again? Colonel Watkins authorized 3 more performances, then 5, then 10. By summer, the Camp McCain Opera Company was the hottest ticket in Mississippi. Other camps took notice. Camp Como, also in Mississippi, had Italian prisoners with musical talent. They staged La Traviata. Camp Clinton staged Il Trovatore. Camp Monticello put on Madama Butterfly, which required elaborate sets and makeup to suggest Japan. Competition emerged. Which camp had the best orchestra? The best tenor? The most elaborate production? The phenomenon spread beyond Mississippi. Camp Letterkenny in Pennsylvania staged Carmen. Camp Mexia in Texas performed Cavalleria Rusticana. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, prisoners built a 700-seat theater and performed multiple operas to sold-out crowds. The productions varied in quality, but the dedication was universal. These men needed music the way they needed food and water. For the local communities, the operas became cultural events that transcended the war. Women dressed up. Men wore their best suits. Families drove hours to attend. For many rural Southerners, it was their first exposure to opera. They discovered they loved it. The emotional directness, the soaring melodies, the dramatic stories, all resonated deeply with people who'd been raised on hymns and folk ballads. But there was controversy. Not everyone approved. Some saw it as coddling the enemy. American soldiers were dying in Europe and the Pacific. And here were Italian prisoners, enjoying themselves, performing for adoring crowds. Letters poured into the War Department. Congressmen received angry phone calls. How could this be allowed? The military's response was pragmatic. Happy prisoners caused fewer problems. The opera companies reduced escape attempts, improved morale, and made camp management easier. Moreover, the Geneva Convention required adequate recreation for POWs. If they wanted to stage operas, that was their right. And perhaps most importantly, it made America look good. If even enemy prisoners could access culture and art in American camps, what did that say about American values? There was also a strategic element. Italy had technically switched sides after September 1943. These prisoners were now co-belligerents, sort of allies, though their status remained murky. Treating them well made diplomatic sense. When the war ended, America would need Italian cooperation. These prisoners would return home with stories of their treatment. Better those stories involved opera than abuse. Still, the sight bothered some people. Mrs. Helen Crawford of Jackson, Mississippi, lost her son at Anzio in January 1944. When she heard about the opera performances at Camp McCain, her first reaction was rage. How dare they entertain themselves while her boy lay dead in Italian soil? She wrote a furious letter to the camp commander demanding the performances stop. Colonel Watkins did something unexpected. He invited her to attend. She almost refused, but something made her accept. She sat in the audience for Rigoletto, arms crossed, determined to hate it. But when Antonio Bellini sang La Donna Mobile, something in her broke. She realized these men hadn't killed her son. War had killed her son. These were just men trying to survive, trying to hold on to something beautiful in a world full of ugliness. She left in tears, but not tears of anger. She never became a fan of the operas. She couldn't. But she stopped writing letters demanding they end. Years later, she'd tell her grandchildren that watching enemy soldiers sing opera was one of the strangest experiences of her life. I realized they missed their homes as much as I missed my boy. It didn't make anything right, but it made them human. The performances continued through 1944 and into 1945. As the war in Europe wound down, the question became what would happen to these prisoners. Italy was being rebuilt. American troops controlled much of the country. Repatriation began in late 1945, but it took months. The opera companies kept performing almost until the last prisoners shipped out. The final performance at Camp McCain happened in October 1945. They chose La Bohème, Puccini's masterpiece about young artists in Paris, trying to create beauty despite poverty and hardship. The parallels weren't subtle. These performers were themselves artists far from home, using their craft to survive difficult circumstances. The final scene, where Mimi dies and Rodolfo realizes too late that he loved her, destroyed the audience. People sobbed openly, not just for the fictional characters, but for everything the war had stolen. For the years lost, for the people who'd never come home, for the impossible strangeness of this moment, watching Italian prisoners perform Italian opera in Mississippi, knowing it would never happen again. When the performance ended, the audience stood and applauded for 20 minutes. The performers took their bows, many of them crying. They'd be shipping home soon, back to an Italy that had been devastated by war. They didn't know what awaited them. Jobs? Homes? Would their families even still be alive? The uncertainty was crushing. But they'd created something remarkable. In the midst of history's most destructive war, inside a prison camp, they'd made art. They'd reminded themselves, and everyone who watched that beauty still existed. That music could transcend hatred. That even enemies could share something profound if they just listened to each other. Antonio Bellini returned to Italy in November 1945. He found his home in Naples destroyed by bombing. His wife had survived, but barely. The city was rubble and hunger. Work was impossible to find. But he kept singing. He performed in makeshift theaters, in churches, in open-air venues. Within 2 years, he'd rebuilt his career. He sang at La Scala again, at La Fenice in Venice, in opera houses across Europe. In 1960, he toured America. When his schedule included a performance in Memphis, just 200 miles from Camp McCain, he made a special request. Could he visit the camp? Most of it had been demolished after the war, but he wanted to see it anyway. The military arranged it. He stood where the theater had been, now just an empty field with grass and wildflowers. He sang La Donna Mobile one more time, his voice still strong at 65, the notes carrying across the empty space where he'd once performed for Americans and prisoners alike. A reporter asked him what the opera company had meant to him. He thought for a long time before answering. We were prisoners, but we were also artists. The war took everything from us except that. The music reminded us who we were. And I think maybe it reminded the Americans too. We weren't monsters. We weren't even really enemies. We were just men who wanted to go home. The opera helped everyone remember that. Giuseppe Romano, the conductor, had a different experience. He returned to Rome and found the conservatory where he'd studied had been damaged, but was being repaired. He taught there for 30 years, training new generations of conductors. He never spoke much about his time as a prisoner, but he kept a photograph on his desk. It showed the Camp McCain Orchestra in their makeshift formal wear, instruments raised, frozen in mid-performance. Whenever students asked about it, he'd smile. That was when I learned what music really means. Not the notes on the page, the connection between people. That's what matters. The 3 American women who'd sung with the Italian prisoners had their own stories. Sarah Mitchell married a man from Grenada and taught music at the local high school for 40 years. She never performed opera professionally, But she told her students about singing Gilda opposite an Italian POW tenor in a Mississippi prison camp. Most of them didn't believe her until she showed them the program and photographs. It taught me something important, she'd say. Art doesn't care about borders or politics. Music is music, wherever it comes from. The phenomenon of POW opera companies faded from public memory quickly after the war. America had new concerns: the Cold War, the atomic age, Korea. The strange interlude when enemy prisoners staged world-class operas in southern prison camps seemed almost like a fever dream, too odd to be real. Archives collected the programs and photographs, but few people looked at them. In the 1990s, a historian named Robert Kramer began researching POW camps in the American South. He stumbled across references to opera performances and assumed they were exaggerations. Prisoners singing some songs, maybe. But full productions of Verdi and Puccini? That seemed implausible. Then he found the photographs, the reviews, the detailed programs. It was all real. His book, Prisoners of War in America, included an entire chapter on the opera phenomenon. It sparked renewed interest. Documentaries were made. Interviews were conducted with surviving audience members, now in their 80s and 90s. They all said the same thing. The performances were extraordinary, professional quality. The prisoners had poured their souls into the music. One woman, now 92, remembered attending La Baume at Camp McCain with her parents when she was 17. "I'd never heard anything like it," she said. "We lived in a tiny town. We had church choir and school band. But this was different. This was real opera, sung by real opera singers who just happened to be prisoners. It changed what I thought was possible. If beautiful things could happen in a prison camp, maybe beautiful things could happen anywhere." The story resonates because it challenges our assumptions about war and enemies and human nature. These men were technically the enemy. They'd fought against America, been captured, imprisoned. Every rule of war said they should be kept at a distance, dehumanized, made into abstractions. But music made that impossible. You can't listen to someone sing Verdi with their whole heart and soul and still think of them as just an enemy. They become human. Complicated, flawed, homesick, talented humans trying to survive something terrible. The American audiences who attended these performances learned something profound. The Italians weren't monsters. They were men. They missed their families. They wanted to go home. They loved beauty. They needed art. In every important way, they were exactly the same as the Americans watching them. The only difference was accidents of birth and politics. That recognition, that moment of common humanity, mattered more than all the propaganda in the world. There's a recording that survived from Camp Como's production of La Traviata in 1944. The quality is poor, captured on primitive equipment, full of hiss and distortion. But you can still hear the passion in the singing. These weren't men going through the motions. They were pouring everything they had into Verdi's music about love and loss and death. You can hear the homesickness, the fear, the desperate need to create something beautiful in a world being torn apart. The recording lasts 3 minutes. Just one aria, Addio del passato, Violetta's farewell to her past as she dies. The voice belongs to a prisoner whose name was never recorded. He's singing in Italian, accompanied by a piano that's slightly out of tune. But the emotion is devastating. He's not just singing about Violetta's death. He's singing about everyone and everything the war destroyed. All the futures that would never happen. All the people who'd never go home. When the aria ends, you can hear applause. Muffled, distant, but enthusiastic. Americans clapping for an Italian prisoner singing about death in an opera written by another Italian composer more than half a century earlier. That moment, preserved on deteriorating tape, captures everything remarkable about what happened in those camps. Art transcended everything. For 3 minutes, there was no war. There were only people moved by beauty. The camps are gone now. Camp McCain was demolished in 1946. The buildings were sold as scrap. The land returned to farmland and forest. Nothing remains except historical markers and memories. Camp Como, Camp Clinton, all the others, same story. They existed for a brief moment in history, served their purpose, then vanished. But the music remains. Not just the recordings, though those are precious. The music remains in the lives it touched. The Americans who discovered opera for the first time. The Italian prisoners who found purpose and hope through performance. The women who sang alongside enemy soldiers and learned that enemies were just people. All of them carried the experience forward, and it shaped how they saw the world. In 2004, the city of Grenada, Mississippi, erected a memorial to the Camp McCain Opera Company. It's a simple monument, a bronze plaque showing a stage with barbed wire in the background. The inscription reads, "Here, enemy prisoners became artists. Here, music proved stronger than war. Here, humanity survived." Every year, on the anniversary of the final performance, a small group gathers at the site. Music students from the local college. Historians. Veterans. Descendants of prisoners and guards and audience members. Someone reads Antonio Bellini's quote about remembering who we are. Then a soprano sings La Donna Mobile, the aria that started it all. Her voice carries across the empty field where once stood a theater built by prisoners. The song ends. People stand quietly, remembering something remarkable that happened here 80 years ago. Then they leave, returning to their lives, carrying the story forward. Because that's what we do with beautiful things. We remember them, we share them, we let them change us. In a world that often feels irredeemably broken, that seems caught in endless cycles of hatred and violence, the story of Italian POWs staging opera in Mississippi matters. It reminds us that beauty and art and common humanity can survive even the worst circumstances. That music can bridge any divide. That even enemies can recognize each other's humanity if they just stop and listen. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The camps were demolished. But the music survived. And maybe that's the point. Beauty outlasts everything else. Empires fall, borders change. Wars are fought and forgotten. But a perfect rendition of Verdi, sung with full heart by someone far from home, desperate to remember who they are, that lasts forever. That's what happened behind barbed wire in Mississippi in 1944. Not just performances, not just opera, a reminder that we're all human, all capable of creating and appreciating beauty, all trying to hold on to hope in dark times. The prisoners knew it. The audiences felt it. And now, 80 years later, we can still hear it in that deteriorating recording of a forgotten singer giving everything to Puccini's music. The voice cracks slightly on the final note. You can hear it even through the hiss and distortion. But it doesn't matter. What matters is the attempt, the effort, the refusal to let war destroy everything beautiful. That prisoner, whoever he was, stood on a stage in a prison camp and sang about death and loss and love. And for 3 minutes, everyone listening forgot they were enemies. They were just people, together, experiencing something profound. That's the real victory. Not military, not political, human. The victory of remembering, even in the worst circumstances, that we're capable of more than destruction. That we can create. That we can connect. That music, art, beauty, these things matter more than borders or ideologies or the temporary hatreds that divide us. The opera performances in American POW camps were never repeated. They happened once, in a specific moment, under specific circumstances, and then they were gone. But they proved something essential. That even in war, even in captivity, even when every reason exists to give up and despair, humans will create beauty. We can't help it. It's what we do. It's who we are. And maybe, If we remember that, if we hold on to it, if we let it shape how we see each other, we might create something better than what came before. Not perfect, not utopian, just better, more human, more connected, more willing to listen when others sing. That's what happened in Mississippi in 1944. That's what those Italian prisoners taught America. That's what the audiences learned when they sat in makeshift theaters and heard the enemy sing. We're all just people. We all want to go home. We all need beauty. We all deserve to be heard. The curtain fell on the final performance in October 1945. The prisoners shipped out. The camps closed. But the music never really stopped. It echoes still if you know how to listen. Across the decades, across the empty fields where theaters once stood, you can still hear it. Verdi, Puccini, voices raised in song, prisoners and audiences, enemies and Americans, all connected by something more powerful than war. The music survives. It always does. And as long as we remember it, as long as we tell the story, those Italian prisoners in Mississippi achieved something extraordinary. They prove that beauty can exist anywhere. That art transcends everything. That even enemies can create something together that outlasts all the reasons they had to hate each other. That's the triumph. That's what endures. Not the barbed wire, not the war. The music. Always the music.